Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the Round 2 topic for primary school for 2024, and that topic is that we should ban advertising aimed at children. In this session, we're going to start with a reflection exercise. We're then going to look at the setup for the debate, which is looking at everything that goes before you start to write your speeches. Then we're going to go into a couple of tips about brainstorming, and then a couple of tips of general debating tips towards the end, particularly looking at rebuttal. So the first thing that we're going to do is a reflection exercise. And I think it's really good to do a reflection exercise after every debate, both that you do and that you watch. Even if you didn't debate in your team's first debate, there can still be some merit and some benefit that you can get of reflecting over the debate you watched. In general, I think it's good to try and look for one thing that you think either you, if you were speaking, or if you weren't speaking, someone in your team did, something that was particularly good, and something that you think didn't work as well. I think it's good to try and deliberately get one of each thing. And I think the reason for that is that sometimes when you debate, you'll realize that you said something very smart, but you actually don't entirely know how you got there, especially if it's a piece of rebuttal that you sort of thought of in the middle of a debate. So it's good to be very aware of things that went well so that you can try and do them again and deliberately in your next debate, particularly if there was sort of an accident the first time. But even if it was something that you wrote really well and you thought, well, this worked and I'm going to write this really well again, that can be a productive way to reflect on a debate. And then you also want to look for something that you think you can very much improve on in the next debate as well, and take a note of how you think you can improve on it. A really good way to do this is to take notes during the adjudicator's adjudication of a debate, because usually they will give you a couple of pieces of general feedback in their adjudication that then you can try and apply into your next debate. Additionally, sometimes an adjudicator will, at the end of their adjudication, offer to give you individual feedback after the debate if there's time before the next round. It's usually a good idea to try and take advantage of that when it is offered, because that can be some of the best times to get feedback that is specifically tailored to your speech as opposed to general notes about the debate as a whole. So if you don't have notes from your previous debate, that's okay, but this is just something that I think you should try and deliberately make yourself able to do before your third debate. And if you did have notes, or you at least remember what was talked about in your first debate, I think it's good to pause the video for a bit and do a bit of reflection so that you have a couple of things that you can deliberately focus on in round 2. Once we've finished that, the next thing that we move on to is the context, which is what to research beforehand. And context covers broadly 2 things. The first thing is it involves looking at explanations of words in topics, especially if they're unfamiliar words or they're words that could have contentious meanings. And the second thing is it's trying to work out why the topic has been set. In this type of debate that has the word should in it, that is looking for a problem in the world the affirmative team is going to try and solve. Even if you are the negative team, you want to have a good idea of the problem that the affirmative team will try and solve in case you think that there is a counter model that you might want to run. So here are a few questions that I've thought of that you might want to have a look at, but this is not a complete list. There might be other questions that you want to look at, and that's completely fine as well. So what I've written is firstly the 2 questions of what is advertising and where is advertising. I think this is a good place to start because it's really easy when we hear of words like advertising to think of the most obvious places they exist, things such as in ad breaks during TV shows or ads before movies begin, but to forget that advertising is often all around us in ways that are a bit more subtle. Even if it's quite explicit, things such as advertising on the side of buses or at bus stops or on billboards, sometimes we don't deliberately twig to the fact that that is advertising. We are aware of it, but we don't think of it as advertising as much as we think of ads during TV shows as being advertising, but it very much is. Additionally, sometimes product placement, which is where people use a branded product in some kind of film or TV show or music video, and they use that branded product because they're being paid to use it. For example, if someone eats McDonald's in a TV show, maybe McDonald's is paying them to do that so that they can then get some kind of exposure for their brand and the people can get money for using that product. That is also a type of advertising. The reason why it's good to have an idea of lots of different types of advertising is because people probably react to different types of ads differently. And it's up to you to think of how they might react to them differently. But it might mean that you can think of interesting new arguments or new parts of arguments if you can think of different ways that people will interact with different ads. Additionally, I think there's a couple of questions about more so specifically what is in the ads. So the first thing is this topic is about advertising targeted at children. So you want to think of what kinds of things are advertised to children. The most obvious ones are products that are for children will presumably be advertised to children a lot of the time, but it might also be useful to think of, are there ways in which like family or household products are particularly targeted towards children? Is that a thing, or are they mostly targeted towards adults? I don't know, but there could be reasons why, for example, firstly, maybe they're targeted towards adults because adults have spending power to buy household appliances, but children don't. But maybe they're targeted towards children because adults are more able to say no to themselves wanting something than they are able to say no to their kids wanting something. So if you advertise to the kid, maybe that means that it's harder for the adult to say no to it. I don't know exactly which is more prevalent. It's up to you to research, but here's just the idea that possibly either of them could be true. And additionally, it might be useful to think of, and this will require research, you might not be able to just think of this, are there already rules about advertising? Are there rules about what you can advertise about, when you can advertise? Are there specifically already rules about what can and can't be advertised to children? I don't know the answer to these, but it feels like this type of thing that there very much could be rules on. And it can be useful to look for rules even if they don't exist within a Queensland or an Australian context. If, for example, there are advertising rules in the EU that are different to Australia, that can still be useful to have an idea of, because it means that if you are the negative team, you could potentially propose those alternative rules as some kind of countermodel if you think that they are a better way of solving the affirmative team's problem. But at the same time, if there are rules that already exist in Australia, that's also very useful to know. Now, the other thing is you want to ask some questions that are going to lead you in the direction of finding a problem. So this would be kinds of questions, and it might require some research, but it also might require some level of just sort of brainstorming as a team. But how do people react to ads? Are ads generally successful? Are children particularly vulnerable to ads? Just to have a good idea of why this topic has been set, specifically the fact it's been banning advertising to children, which is a different type of debate than if you were banning things like advertising for alcohol. That would be a really different type of debate. And you've got to ask the question, is this a problem with the things being advertised? Is this a problem with the people that it's being advertised towards? Just have some kind of research about that. So once we've finished looking for the context behind the debate, we then get into starting to write the case. And the first thing is always the definition. Now, some of the words in this topic are the same as words from the first topic, and so I'm going to go through the definitions of those words quite quickly. But if you want a more in-depth explanation of why they are the things that I'm about to say, feel free to look back at the previous video. So the first thing is the word we, and we will always refer to the person that has the ability to implement the policy. It will probably be the Australian or the Queensland government, up to you. You could define we to be the world as a whole, that would also be reasonable, but just remember, have it be narrow and close, or you can broaden it. So don't set it specifically in New South Wales. It can be set specifically in Queensland, or it can be broader than that. The next thing is the word should, which will mean that we have a moral and practical obligation, which means that it is both the right thing to do and that it will create good outcomes. The word ban, which is going to be to completely prohibit something. And then we've got the words from this specific topic. Advertising, which you're going to need to define, and that should be a fairly simple word to define. I think teams are probably going to agree about it. The last one is the one that I think there could be some level of disagreement about, but I'm not sure it's going to impact the arguments much, but it's good to be aware of it. And that is the term aimed at children, because, and this is the ambiguity that I think could exist in this debate, but may not, is does advertising being aimed at children mean that the thing being advertised is a children's product? Is it like all toy advertising is aimed at children no matter what's in the ad? Or is it that being aimed at children is a quality of the ad itself? Could you advertise a family product to children? Or is the fact that it is like a sofa means that it's not aimed at children because it's not a children's product? Up to you to try and define it. I think either is probably reasonable, and you can also say both. That would be totally reasonable. You could say advertising at children means at least one of these two things is true as well. The next thing is models and countermodels. The affirmative team model is going to be fairly simple in this debate because it's a ban debate. The one thing to keep in mind is if you think that you need to think about a consequence for people breaking the ban, and that's up to you to think about if you do need one. You won't have needed one in the tuck shop debate because it's very difficult for people to set up secret tuck shops trying to break the rule that bans them. But maybe people would try and be sneaky about advertising in some way, and you could think about what the consequences of that could be. But again, it's probably not the biggest thing that you need to bring up, because if the negative team makes an argument that says, well, people will just advertise to kids anyway, then the debate is just about less, because it means that fewer ads are being banned, but it also means that all of the good things about ads that the negative team talks about will happen on the affirmative team as well. So it probably wouldn't be the most strategic attack from the negative team to say that the model will be ineffective in this particular debate, but you can think about how are you going to make this model effective as well. The negative team, you can think about if there's an alternative way to try and solve the problem from the debate. Now, the thing to keep in mind in this debate is you're going to be talking about why ads are really good and why we shouldn't ban them. So you want to be very cautious about any restrictions you put on those ads as well. If you're making arguments about how ads are really great and they help companies sell good products, you don't also want to then try and restrict it a lot and say, well, you can only advertise to children between these hours or something like that, because you just limit all of the good things, you make them happen less. So if you have a counter model, make sure that it's not something that is also going to make your argument a bit less persuasive. But if in your research you find, for example, that there's some kind of advertising regulation somewhere that you think is really good and would help solve any problem that you think the affirmative team will point to, and it's not going to undermine your arguments in doing so, it's totally reasonable to run a counter model. And I think there might be some things that you could find in this debate. The next thing in terms of the creating your own team's arguments is the brainstorming phase. And again, this is an area where I probably went into a bit more detail of how to do brainstorming in the first video, but I'll do a very brief recap. In general, the brainstorming phase is one in which you're trying to come up with ideally 4 different ideas that you can try and argue in the debate. Now, and I had some questions about this in the Zoom call earlier this week, is do you need to have 2 points at both first and second speaker? And the answer to that is you don't need to follow that exact rule. You can have more points, you can have fewer points, but I think that 2 and 2 is the sweet spot. And the reason for this is that if you have fewer than 2 points at each speaker, you lose out on the opportunity to have really good points. You might just have really good fourth ideas that you don't ever get to present. I think having fewer than 2 points at either speaker is only really feasible if you are a really, really advanced debater high up in high school and you're really confident that all of the good ideas have been fit into the first speech. But it's very likely that in primary school, a lot of your ideas that you think are good for second speaker will end up being incredibly good points, and you don't want to limit your ability to share those good points by only having 1 point at second speaker. Additionally, you can have more points, and if you were to have more points, you'd probably do it at first speaker because they have more time. But I think having more than 2 points means that each of your points is going to be shorter, and this can limit the extent to which you can explain your points in good detail, explain the importance of your points to the debate and to the adjudicator, and this can mean that your points, even though you end up with more of them, are weakened. And that's why I think that having 2 points at both speakers is a bit of a sweet spot, and you tend to try and have your 2 strongest points at first speaker and then your 2 less strong points at second speaker, but they're still strong points and should be shared. In terms of how to brainstorm them, the general trick is to try and think of all of the different outcomes that are going to occur, or all of the different people that are going to be affected. In this particular debate, I won't tell you exactly what I think the outcomes that each of these groups will face are, but I'll give you a suggestion of a few different groups you might want to think about, and then you can see if you can work out how they might be affected. So I think that kids are probably going to be affected by a topic that bans advertising aimed at them. And I think parents will probably also be affected. I think that advertising companies are going to be affected. The companies that are being advertised, which are importantly often different to the advertising companies, because companies would usually hire an advertising firm to do the advertising or make the ad. So the company that wants their product advertised is going to be affected. You want to think about all of the changes that will exist in the world. So a toy company still wants to sell toys, even if they can't advertise to children, but maybe they now need to change what is going to be their strategy of making their product known. And that's going to be a change in the world. Similarly, if currently ads towards children are on TV, TV shows still want ads because that's going to get them money. And so they're going to get different ads, presumably, and it's up to you to try and work out what kinds of ads would Lego Masters do if they can't have ads about Lego. I'm not sure if Lego Masters does have a lot of ads about Lego, but it would make sense if they did have definitely ads towards children on that kind of show. And you'd have the question of, well, what would they advertise instead? Is that going to be better or worse? This is a far from exhaustive list. It's good to try and go through all of the different people that could be affected and all of the different changes that they will make in terms of what they're planning to do. But again, this is a good point possibly to pause the video to have a go at brainstorming before we go into the next slide, which is a brief recap of how to structure a point. So the next thing is structuring arguments. And again, I think I went into this in a decent bit of detail in the previous video, but I think I focused mostly on setup. So I'll do a bit more explanation here. The biggest part of proving an argument is making it seem really true. And there are a few ways to prove that an argument is true. Lots of things, such as quotes, things such as statistics, things such as examples, things such as personal stories and anecdotes, are ways of suggesting that things are true that you can find when you research within your life or on the internet. But I think that these are not always the most persuasive type of point. I think that one of the problems that I observed when I was adjudicating debates on the first topic from this year is that often people are really good at researching and finding evidence that supports their side, but not as strong at working out why that evidence exists. Here's an example. Often teams on the affirmative side of banning tuck shops would find examples of individual products that were more expensive at tuck shops than they were at supermarkets. And then the negative team against banning tuck shops would also find examples of products that were cheaper at tuck shops than they were at supermarkets. But if both teams have an example, which one should the adjudicator believe more? Because the adjudicator shouldn't really decide, oh, I only believe one of the examples, or they shouldn't really think one of these examples is definitely better than the other unless they're given a reason to believe that one of those examples is better or that one of those examples is likely to be more common. And what you want to do is you want to try and think of why has my example that I found occurred and try and justify it with logic and then use the example to back up your argument. Here is an example, interestingly, of how that is going to work. In that previous debate, you might have the argument, if you are on the negative team of the topic, you're saying that we shouldn't ban tuck shops. You might say, when you buy something from a supermarket, you aren't just paying for the product, you're also paying for the wages of the people that work in that supermarket. However, a school tuck shop is usually run by volunteers, which means that they don't need to be paid for, you don't need to pay extra to pay for the wages of the volunteers. And you could say, additionally, supermarkets try and run for a profit, they try and make money, whilst a school tuck shop isn't necessarily about making money, its primary goal is to give food to kids. And that means that we should believe that in most cases, tuck shops are likely to be cheaper because you aren't paying for profit and you aren't paying for wages, you're just paying for the food. And then you can use the example. You could say, for example, a burger at my tuck shop costs this. However, all of the ingredients combined at a supermarket cost this, and that's more. And you can see how what you've done is you've still used the example, but you've explained why the example is likely to be quite common. And that means that if the other team has an example that goes against your example, you have the ability to say, well, that's less common, and I've given the reason why it's less common. And in general, that's a good way to view points in general. You want to be trying to think of the logical reason why you are usually correct, and that means that any examples that the other team brings, you've explained why they are less likely than examples that support you. And in turn, that means that research is still quite useful because it provides those examples that can back up your logic. But when you do research, you want to then try and work out, either through further research or through thinking, why that outcome has emerged. And that's the big tip for structuring arguments for this week, is really deliberately try and think of why things that you found are true so that you can justify them even more. The next thing we're going to look at is rebuttal. And I'm going to go into a bit of detail here because there were lots of questions about it in the Zoom call. And additionally, I think that it's a good thing to look at after you've had the comfort of going through one debate. Now, the first questions are just very elementary about what rebuttal functionally is and who does it. So if you feel like you have a good idea of this, feel free to skip forward a couple of minutes and hopefully I will have gotten to the later dot points in this. But I'll go through them now. Firstly, who rebuts in a debate? Every speaker other than the first affirmative speaker gets to rebut in a debate. And when you look at the second question, who should you rebut? Every speaker can rebut any speaker that's gone before them. That means that you can rebut every speaker from the other team that has already gone. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should rebut all speakers equally. In general, the most important speaker to rebut is whoever has gone just before you, because you are the first chance to rebut them. And it also will make it easier for your later speakers if you do a good job. Obviously, the first negative speaker only rebuts the first affirmative speaker. So if they do a really good job, then it means that the second negative speaker won't need to rebut the first affirmative speaker much, and they can focus on rebutting the second affirmative speaker, which is useful because they're the first chance to do that. And additionally, if they both do a really good job, it means that the third negative speaker can have a go at rebutting some of the rebuttal from the third affirmative speaker, and then later get into rebutting all of the points as well. If everyone does a good job at rebutting, it will then make the job of their next speaker a bit easier in that regard. Now, the additional thing is, even if you are like the second negative speaker, you can rebut the first speaker's points, but you should focus on doing new rebuttal before things that have already been rebutted. So that's the additional thing, is if you have multiple speakers that have gone before you, anything that they've already given as a piece of rebuttal, you don't need to make the most important piece of rebuttal that you have. The next question is, how long should you rebut? Now, this is again something that probably varies a bit speaker to speaker. For first negative speakers, rebuttal is not the most important part of your speech. The most important part of a first negative speaker's speech is their points. And the reason for that is that rebuttal is an exercise in making the other teams seem not as strong and to say no, but very infrequently will you saying no result in an active yes to your team. Making the other team's argument as bad as possible doesn't necessarily make your argument good unless you've made your argument well in the first place. And so the focus of first negative should be to make their arguments really well, because it then gives a platform that you can then compare to the other team and prove that you've done a really good job in writing your points. So in general, that means that the first negative speaker should do a bit of rebuttal, but their main focus should be on the points. When you get to second speakers then, you should probably aspire to have about a similar amount of time spent on rebuttal as on your points. Now, in primary school, usually you won't get that far in rebuttal. Usually your points, which you're able to prepare before the debate, will take longer, and that's completely fine. But a sort of good point of aspiration is that year 5, 6, and 7 debating all have the same times. You speak for 4 minutes to 4 minutes 30 in all of them, and it's a good thing to try and aim to, by the end of year 7, be rebutting for about as long as your points when you're a second speaker. This means that, and a couple of ways to get there are, firstly, second negative speakers can rebut the first affirmative speaker. You can have more pieces of rebuttal if you think that there are important things that you have to say, especially if they haven't been said by your first speaker. And additionally, your points, while they are going to be very important, if you've done a really good job brainstorming and working together as a team, usually your points won't be as good as the first speaker's point. Not that they'll be bad points. If you've brainstormed and worked well as a team, they'll be really good as well. But you will have made sure you know what your best arguments are. And your first speakers will have made the best arguments. And that means that you don't have points that are as consequential, even if they are still very good. So in general, second speakers aim to rebut for as long as you feel comfortable that still leaves you at least half your speech to do your own points. And lastly, third speakers. Third speakers should rebut for as long as they can. Things like summaries are not the most important part of a third speaker's speech. And the reason for that is that a summary will not change the adjudicator's mind. An adjudicator has already heard all of your team's points, so summarizing them won't change the adjudicator's mind. They probably already know if they are going to believe them or not. But rebuttal is new. The adjudicator hasn't heard your rebuttal of the other team yet, and the adjudicator has heard the other team's points, which means until you rebut them, their points are probably quite persuasive to the adjudicator. Rebuttal is the big chance you have to change the adjudicator's mind as a third speaker, especially if the other team has done a better job with their points. Third speakers can swing the result of the debate through their rebuttal, but they won't through their summary. And so a goal should be to try and rebut for as long as you can. And if that means that you don't have time to do a particularly long summary and you just have time to say, my first speaker gave these 2 points, this, my second speaker gave these 2 points, that, and that's your whole summary, that's completely fine if you've done a really good job doing a lot of rebuttal. But at the same time, if you don't feel comfortable rebutting for 3.5 minutes, it's okay to have a long summary. It's okay to do that if it makes you feel more comfortable, if it makes you feel more confident because you're speaking for longer. That's completely fine. But again, it's sort of a point of aspiration. You should aim to be, by the end of year 7 debating, rebutting for almost the whole 4 minutes, and then summarizing very briefly. The next thing is, what should you rebut? Now, for the same reasons as I was suggesting in the making a good argument, things like examples, things like statistics, things like quotes are not the most persuasive part of the other team's point, and that means that they're not the most important things to rebut. Because rebuttal is an exercise in trying to change the adjudicator's mind, you want to tackle the other team head on, and you want to try and work out what is their best argument, what will make them persuasive. Your job is to make that unpersuasive. So if they have a really good logical reason, you want to actually try and come up with a reason why that logic is wrong. Let's go back to the example I was explaining before, which was that you're on the negative side of the tuck shop debate, and you say it's going to be cheaper at tuck shop because you're not paying for lots of extra things in addition to all of the food. Now, if you were to try and rebut that, you don't want to go for the example that I gave afterwards. You don't want to say, well, actually at my school, a burger costs more at tuck shop than it does at the supermarket. Maybe that's true, but it doesn't disprove the logic. It takes down the example, but the adjudicator will still think that most of the time the other team is correct. So what you want to do is you want to try and find a hole in the logic. Maybe you can think of the fact, well, they said that tuck shop doesn't try and make a profit. However, actually, tuck shop is usually used as a fundraising tool to fund school events and resources. Things such as laptops in classrooms, things such as school sports days, things such as school plays. And you can then think, well, what you've done is you've rebutted the logic. Even if they have the good example of the fact that the burger is cheap, you've now proven that usually tuck shops are trying to make money. And that's a reason to believe that they would make prices more expensive, more than they wouldn't, so they can make money. And then you can sort of get to the point of thinking, the opposition is wrong and you've disproved their logic, and most of the time you'll be correct. The second way that you can try and rebut something is, rather than say that something is wrong, you could say that the other team is incorrect about whether it's good or not. So let's say that the debate has played out the way I've just explained. The negative team has made that point about tuck shop cheapness. The affirmative team has responded by saying, well, tuck shops are trying to raise money for fundraising. What the negative team might do then is they might think, well, here's why that's untrue. Maybe they have a reason why tuck shops usually aren't used for fundraising. Maybe they say that there are lots of other ways that are used for fundraising, such as like cake stalls or sausage sizzles, which are different from tuck shop because tuck shop's role is to give people lunch and those things are to give people treats. And that's a reason to believe that the other team is wrong. But they could alternatively try this second thing, which is persuade the adjudicator that the other team's material is not important or is important for a different reason than the other team thinks. You might say, well, actually, they're right. It is true. Our school tuck shop does also fundraise. Oh no, they're probably correct. but you can then think of why the other team is unimportant. You could say, well, it's true that it is expensive, but that's not important because firstly, parents don't need to buy from Tuckshop. Even if Tuckshop exists, they can choose to buy from home. And that means that we shouldn't ban Tuckshop because people are not being forced to buy expensive things. So it's unimportant that it's more expensive. Or you could even go further. You could try and say that the other team's point leads to the wrong conclusion overall. And you could say, if it's true that Tuckshop is used for fundraising, actually that is a good thing. And it is a good thing that Tuckshop is expensive, because if it wasn't for expensive Tuckshop, we wouldn't be able to hold school events like sports days or have laptops in classrooms. And you can see how that piece of rebuttal, again, it doesn't attack an example, it attacks the logic. Either it provides a reason why they're wrong, or it provides a reason why the other team is wrong about whether it's good or not. Hopefully those examples made some amount of sense, and they illustrate a few ways that you can try and have a go at rebutting arguments without necessarily targeting examples or things that are not the logic overall. But if you still have questions about that, feel free to try and ask your adjudicator at your next debate, or to go on the Zoom call for the next QDU Academy session, and I'll answer any follow-up questions people have about rebuttal. Now, at this point, the video has now concluded. I'll remind you that obviously if you're watching this, you have found the YouTube channel, which means plugging the YouTube channel isn't going to be the most important thing. But if there was something that I haven't explained fully in this video, especially if it's something in the stages of definitions or models, things that go in the setup before we got to brainstorming, it's very likely that I covered them in a bit more depth in the previous video for round 1. So feel free to go back and have a look at that to see if any questions that you have about the first half of this video was answered there. And then if you continue to be a bit confused, then we have the QDU Talent LMS, which hopefully your school coordinator has information about from our program manager that you can access, or you can contact us, hop on the next Zoom call in a few weeks before the round 3 topic and ask any follow-up questions that you have then. I'll be very happy to answer them. But thank you very much all for watching and paying attention and listening along. Best of luck in this debate, and best of luck for all of your debating endeavors in the future.